What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Lightspeed. Today, we're joined by Abhay Kumar from the Helium Foundation. Abhay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, we're pumped to have you. Look, working in crypto, I know this is probably the same for you. One of the first things people ask me is like, what does crypto actually enable? And besides like for the world's greatest online, global casino, what does it do? It's kind of hard to explain. I think one of the best things I can point to is stablecoins and payments. But after that, one of the most interesting sectors is actually DePIN, which is what Helium is doing. So I'd love for you, before we go deep into what Helium is, if you could just describe what DePIN is at a high level and maybe a little bit of the history behind it.
That's fun. I love the sort of connection to payments because that's what I did before anything in DePIN. But yeah, so DePIN in general is this concept that I guess Sami at Masari came up with the acronym, but this idea is a decentralized physical infrastructure network, and I think there have been a couple of versions of these like acronyms. There's like TIPIN, token incentivized physical infrastructure networks. I tried to meme something into existence, Helium inspired. We weren't the first, so we can't really say that we were the first one of these things. I think LivePeer was, and that project has been running for a few years longer than us. But generally speaking, this is like a way to bootstrap a physical marketplace. That's really the way that I think of all of these kinds of networks. There's a resource that is needed by some consumer out there, and in our case, these are wireless networks, and you have excess excess supply of this, and so that's really what these kinds of networks kind of enable is sort of bootstrapping that kind of marketplace very, very quickly, building up a tremendous amount of supply very quickly, and then hoping to meet the demand that is there at the time that when that supply is created.
So that concept of maybe a marketplace for physical infrastructure is not too obvious of a concept, I would say. So maybe one interesting place to start from would be, how did Helium start? Like, what's the founding story? Like, was it like a eureka moment, or was it a gradual process? Like maybe it wasn't crypto at first, then you guys added crypto. Like, how did that look like?
Yeah, so Helium as the original company behind the Helium network, now it's called Nova Labs. That company's been around for now over 10 years. They started off as an IoT company. They were building really everything from the protocol to the networking layer to the sensors themselves, or the sensor platform themselves, the gateway platform, the data layer between the two, and sort of the analytics platform. They were focused on particular verticals. So they were looking at cold supply chain, putting temperature sensors in super cold fridges at UCSF Medical Center or in restaurants. And those are the places where there was a need on a campus. But as soon as you left that campus, there was no more coverage, right? And at the time, like, how do you really this incentivization problem wasn't really thought about until later on, many years in, when they realized that they needed this sort of wide network to be able to build very generic applications. For example, if you have like a package tracking application, you want to slap a sticker on the side of a box. As soon as that box leaves a depot, it no longer has any coverage, and you don't want to go ask for every single Wi-Fi AP's like password along the way, the route of that package. Similarly, like if you have 100,000 sensors sitting out in the field, it is incredibly expensive to connect all of those into a cellular network. So that's really like Helium came as a protocol that was to sort of enable these kinds of very, very large applications. For very, very simple data, like very small data sets.
So Helium started, I think, in 2013, 14-ish, but you released your first product, or you could actually start mining and like having these hotspots in 2019. And that was all around IoT, which is you're talking about. And I think it's interesting. I don't know if this will tie in later. I was actually at a company where we worked in agriculture, and we provided loans to farmers based on the grain that they had on site. One of the problems is if a grower lies about how much grain they have, you could provide a loan and you have nothing backing that. So what we wanted to do is put IoT sensors in these grain silos so you could measure actually how much grain was there, and you could go even further and get the quality. One of the problems we ran into was the cost. But it sounds like that was something that you were trying to solve, is really lean into this IoT paradigm that I think was it was a big narrative, but it almost got lost somewhere. I don't know if it was too expensive or what. So I'm just curious. Yeah, how did that IoT strategy go? Because I know now you're also doing mobile, right? You're providing 5G plans.
Yeah, I mean, I think so in the last 4 years, the IoT network's grown tremendously, right? There are hundreds of thousands of nodes been deployed all over the world, coverage in every major city that's out there. I think like ultimately, if you want to build an application that is a sort of sensing application and you want a low power network, Helium is your choice, right? Think of it like the macro network for the world. And we think about macro networks and private networks and in cellular, like this is the macro network for IoT in my mind. And I think that is only possible because of the sort of rapid deployment of these kinds of hotspots. Your grand example it reminds me of a hack that someone did a while back. This is now maybe over 2 years ago, where someone was trying to figure out how much coffee was in their roaster bucket. And the way they did that was they put a sensor on the inside of the lid. So every time they close the lid, you could basically figure out the depth of the space that was in there. And so you could essentially invert that. And now you can know how much coffee beans are in your thing. And they could figure out, oh, it's time to go, roast some more coffee beans. So, like your case, you're looking effectively for an inverse, like distance sensor. And I think that something like that is possible, especially if you think about Helium as a network. You're talking about a silo that is located, in the middle of farmland. Helium uses on the IoT side uses a protocol called LoRaWAN. You have a tremendous amount of range with LoRaWAN, right? You can cover tens.
Can you cover what that is?
What's that?
Can you just describe quickly what LoRaWAN is, just for people who might not be familiar?
Yeah, so LoRaWAN is a low power wide area network protocol, and the idea is that it's primarily for very, very small packets. Think 24 bytes of data, and so what you can put in there is something like a temperature reading, a GPS reading, something like a distance reading, like the small integers, perfectly fine, right? And you can send these over very, very long distances. Typically, you're in the sub-gigahertz spectrum. In the US, it's 900 megahertz. In Europe, it's 868. And so, like, these packets can travel really, really far distances. The sensors themselves are incredibly cheap. And then, you use a network like Helium, and you're paying, fractions of a penny per packet. At scale, think like 100,000 messages cost you $1.
That's crazy. So Helium's the largest IoT network, which is insane to me. What is the secret like sauce behind that? Where does crypto come into play, and like what makes it that you're able to build out that network so successfully?
So we introduced a couple of things, and that's for what launched in 2019. And we introduced this concept of proof of coverage, and proof of coverage is really this sort of bootstrap incentive. When you have a hotspot that you deploy, you're sort of claiming that you're in a certain location. But you don't really know if that location is actually real, because blockchains don't know anything about the physical world. So you sort of need to introduce information about the physical world. So, each of these hotspots at the time would actually run a full copy of the blockchain. When we first launched, that's since changed. But they would also kind of challenge each other. And so the way they would do this is they would sort of send out a beacon, and other hotspots around it would be able to witness them. And all of that information got written on chain, and an algorithm decided whether or not that was a expected kind of reading. And if it was expected, both the beaconer and the witnesser got rewarded for that work, right? So they were doing work. They were mining in order to get those tokens at the time.
So you said that each beacon used to have its own copy of the blockchain, the entire blockchain, and that blockchain was at the time the Helium blockchain, right? You guys had your own.
That's right.
L1. Can you maybe go back to those days and discuss like what that was like building your own L1 essentially for this specific application? Because obviously there's now the app chain thesis, which is like, if apps become big enough, they'll like create their own L1 and capture the fees and whatnot. But you guys did actually the opposite. You had your own L1 and you're like, nope, that's too much operations. We're going to actually go to a general purpose L1.
Yeah, I mean, carrying a pager for block production sucks. Like, let's just be direct about it. I was one of many that had to do that too. So, I think running your own L1 while also building a wireless network are two enormous problems, and they are two sort of very divergent problems as well, right? Like I think that for folks that are thinking about the sort of blockchain side of it, block production, transaction validation, consensus, those are all really, really like interesting, cool technical problems. They need to serve a somewhat generic use case, even if every blockchain needs something like transfers and payments and consensus. The fact that we also had things like proof of coverage and, we had a sort of state channel, kind of layer two on our original chain as well. Like all of those bits were important for our particular application, but like you still need all the base layer stuff, right? And I think that that took a lot of our time. And at the time, like if you were going to ask, like, what is Helium for? Is it to do block production, or is it to create an enormous wireless network? I think the answer is pretty obvious. But hindsight bias is what it is, right? At the time, also there wasn't really another option, right? So this is 2019. The design of this started in 2018. Everything was on the table at the time, right? Can we put Bitcoin miners on every one of these hotspots? No, that's not going to work. Is Ethereum an option at the time? We looked at it. It really didn't make sense. We were concerned about long-term fees. Still a concern. Hasn't changed really. So I think that and Solana didn't exist at the time either. And so at the time, like making our own blockchain actually made sense. Running it on those nodes themselves also made sense. There was about a year before we moved to Solana, a little over a year that we moved to Solana, we actually moved consensus off of those blockchain, off of the actual hotspots themselves, and moved to stake validators. And that's also made sense at the time, right? And I think all of these things in hindsight, sure, like could we have moved chains earlier? Of course. Could we have skipped the validator step? Probably, right? But when you're in the thick of it, when you're constantly firefighting, both at keeping a chain up and building a wireless network, you sort of make the decisions that are right at the time, I think, and you sort of try to convince the community. One thing that I really appreciate about Helium's ecosystem is we've been very involved with the community, and the community has been very involved in the evolution of the network from the beginning, right? Like it started off as a Slack group. It turned into a Discord channel. The Discord channel has, 100,000 people on it. The amount of governance participation is higher than I've seen in pretty much any other crypto network. And it's something that if you look at real voting, off chain and in the, in the real world, crypto is pretty bad just in general, right? Like we just don't have a lot of participation. But at least within our bubble, I guess we do pretty well. But I still want to get that to be better. But yeah, it's been really great to like continually evolve, continue to, make choices that turn out to be imperfect and then continue to iterate, right? Like this is something that I appreciate about Helium and, kind of what I work on. Prior to Helium, I did some stuff in Bitcoin and, it's a very different kind of mindset, I think.
Yeah, I think that's super underrated. Like the fact that DePIN protocols essentially are almost like DAOs, and actually they're probably the most successful example of DAOs that I'm aware of. Like the governance aspect for Helium, Hive Mapper, things like this, Render even, is very involved as opposed to like a Discord chat and people just are talking about JPEGs. Okay, so it's, I don't know, let's say it's like 3 a.m. or something. You get paged, block production is stalled, some crazy L1 deep issue. What is the thought process? How did you guys decide? You must have evaluated a bunch of different chains, a bunch of different options. What is the decision? You're like, okay, we're going to go with Solana. Like, how did that come to be?
There are a couple of things that sort of came in. One was like knowledge of the Solana ecosystem. That definitely was a huge part of it, and kind of knowledge of the Solana team. Like that definitely was a part of it. Also, like we started looking at other at what are the options out there? Like can we we started with Ethereum, right? Like, hey, like, can we just do ETH L1? Like, can we settle to the L1? Can we build our own L2? Like, all those things were considered. Um, fees are still something that we think about. Like, we had to move 900,000 wallets, 700,000 wallets, 900,000 hotspots, somewhere, right? Hotspots on our chain weren't really NFTs. Like, I think an NFT is really an implementation detail, to be honest. And that's how we did it on Solana with compression. But, all, and I'm sure someone's probably mad at me saying that. But like, I mean, it ultimately is like, I'm an engineer that just needs a tool, right? Like, that's an implementation detail that's how we implemented it. Maybe there's another way to do it too, but on Solana, that's the way that it made sense. How would you implement every single, how would you reify every single hotspot and every single location in the world on chain and in some of these other chains? Like, that was something that we had to consider. Solana was, with compression, that was sort of the way to do it. There were some like somewhat seemingly minor things, but actually I think pretty important things. So, one was key compatibility that we thought about a lot. Helium uses the Edwards curve for all of our sort of user wallet keys, almost all of them, but effectively 98% of them. And being able to very easily migrate those wallets to Solana was actually a pretty important thing, because now there's no bridge risk and there's no like potential helium2.com/claim, but like website that gets thrown up, some like phishing thing where like a bunch of Helium wallets get rugged. Like, that was something that like we didn't have to think about that at all, because we just said, hey, on this day, our chain's going to halt, and within a few hours, all of your user state is now sitting over here. Like, it literally was like, a few hours of downtime, and me and Noah trying to like shove that thing over here, roughly speaking. And that was great, like, to be able to tell that story. And like the user experience for most people was, they opened up the wallet one day and they were on the Helium L1. The next day they opened up the wallet, there was like a little spinner saying, hey, like, come back a little bit. And then the day after that, they opened the wallet and it says migrating to Solana, status bar finishes, and you're now just using Solana, right? Like, there's nothing else to do. And that kind of user experience is something that is, I think, core to the, personal ideology on how you build products, but also like how we've done things in Helium all along. Like, most people that come to Helium don't know anything about crypto. They don't know anything about radios, but they like join this Discord channel, join the enclosures and off-grid channel, and like figure out how to put up giant antennas on their roof and post like sick ass pictures of like where they are. Like, that's these are novices that have become sort of amateur, almost experts at radio and at crypto, just by like sort of being introduced to this project. That's who we're solving for. And so it's kind of important, I think, to like build the user experience that's perfect for them.
Yeah, but it's funny. I first heard of Helium from my friends who don't pay attention to crypto at all, that started a group chat during like the 2021 bull market. They're like, oh, you got to order these like Helium devices, and then you can start mining H&T. And it was like this, there was a lot of hype. And it was funny because I was kind of in crypto at the time, but I hadn't heard of it. But these people that didn't understand crypto at all did. And I think one reason is people just could relate to like IoT and mobile a lot more than they could like, this is some DEX where you can like do recursive loops and so forth. So I think it does like, it connects with like the average user or individual a lot more. And that's probably why you hear some people say that they think DePIN could be like one of the catalysts for the next bull market, but we'll maybe talk about that later. One thing I would like to double down on is you talked about during this migration, which happened, I think, in April 2023, you had to mint all of these hotspots. I'm just curious, I think it's over 1 million or close to 1 million hotspots that you have today. How does like the NFT and NFT compression and these hotspots work? Like, is it, okay, so if I have a hotspot, I plug it in and somehow I receive an NFT for it. Like, how do those play together, and how do you incentivize the network to go to like new regions to get coverage in an area that's maybe lacking that coverage right now?
Great question. Yeah. So like the NFT themselves, as I said, and diminishes what the work behind it, of course, but it's an implementation detail of this thing that exists in the physical world, right? That thing in the physical world has attributes. It has a location. It has some antenna information associated with it. All of that in metadata is stored, sort of associated with this compressed NFT. you know, when you sort of onboard your device, you're effectively like sort of providing that information, and then the sort of proof of coverage, what it does on the IoT side specifically, has different sort of scaling factors on whether or not your area is very dense or not very dense. When you when your hotspot is sort of participating in a proof of coverage challenge, you broadcast to your neighbors, and your neighbors say, "Hey, I saw you," and then all of that information sort of gets aggregated, and that activity is actually what gets rewarded prior to any data transfer happening. Separately, if there's data transfer that happens, when let's say there's 10 packets that go over your radio because it's there, and it's always listening. LoRaWAN's an Aloha protocol, essentially sensors just shouting in every direction, or whatever direction, depending on the type of antenna that it is. And then any hotspot around it can pick it up, and they're all kind of racing to be the one that says, "Hey, like, can you, would you buy this packet?" And we have this sort of packet routing infrastructure that buys the packet, has rules around how many hotspots the user ultimately wants to buy from. If you just want a single sensor reading, you might just buy it once. If you want to do some kind of trilateration, like you might buy it from 3, 5, 7 hotspots. Like those are all like options that you might have. But all of that activity gets paid for on chain. And then like ultimately, if you're putting a hotspot up, one of the things that you're thinking about is what is the density of hotspots, other hotspots that are in this area? Is this a new area that has never been covered? Is this an area that needs more redundancy? LoRaWAN as a protocol kind of naturally rewards redundancy. You want to have, a hotspot has like a range of tens of square kilometers. So having multiple hotspots in an area is a good thing. But, it shouldn't be like what's happened in San Francisco or New York or any, a lot of the large cities in the US, where you just have a tremendous, like way too much coverage than you need. Like I think there was a time there was like 1,200 hotspots in San Francisco, and that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know that you like reward people more based on areas that you need coverage, for example. And then the more devices you have in an area, like that yield goes down. Almost like if you were staking a protocol, the more stakers you have, the lower that yield is. One last like kind of more technical question. I'm curious at a high level how you think about oracles, because I feel like oracles are really important to anything. Like what's cool about DePIN is you're integrating into the real world. But with real world assets, whether you're financing, house, real estate, like something that Maker's trying to do, or in this case, it's kind of like it could be the Achilles heel of the protocol as well, because you have to depend on that oracle to bring off-world data online. Similar to the silo example I gave, we could have an IoT device, but if it's broken or someone can mess with it, then it's completely inaccurate data. It doesn't matter that it's permissionless on chain. So I'm just curious, like how do you think about oracles and crypto at a high level? Is that something that's actually scalable without either running into fraud or some type of difficulty?
I think you need to layer the information, right? So there's like sort of a base set of information that you get. It provides you some level of trust, and you add on some more information that gives you more trust. And sort of the way that I think oracles get secured is by how much sort of layers of trust from multiple parties that can be sort of applied together to build up a sort of trust score. I'll give you an example of this that I think Helium could play a role in, and this is around container tracking for shipping. When a boat comes into a bay, like it's being tracked by GPS. It might have a transponder. That is information that is those are two oracles, right? Like the transponder that's on the boat could be manipulated, of course, but probably trustworthy because there's some legal ramifications to that. The GPS is fairly hard to spoof, but it's doable. Like you can build sort of fake constellations around around antennas, and you can sort of reposition assets. Like that's another thing. But if you have multiple layers of sort of redundant data that's coming in, you can also have LoRaWAN sensors in every single one of these containers. And when that container enters, all the hotspots around could could also pay attention and sort of transfer some information about, hey, it entered this port of entry, or hey, it's now over by the actual port, or hey, it's just hanging out. Like San Francisco, we have like a line of boats like lined up in front of Oakland Harbor, and especially during COVID, like we saw the worst of it, where there was just a giant backup of these full ocean going vessels all in the bay. All that's like important data, and you can layer on different sources. Helium sensors is one. Something like Planet Labs, satellite information is another, and all this together can build this sort of, I think, this layer of trust. And I think that's where oracles scale over time. It's like, how do you bring on multiple sources and layer on the trust?
When you were just talking there, somebody just created a Telegram chat between Helios, but then their team, and then they named it Helium in that team, and that's the first time that's ever happened. So for people who don't know, my company is called Helios. Obviously, sounds a lot like helium, which is a complete something I didn't realize it sounds after.
It's a little confusing.
Yeah, and somebody just for the first time ever made a group chat and then confused Helios for helium in their thing. So I thought that was very interesting. One thing?
It's okay. We're basically the same. This is actually maybe the first time we've ever been together. So I think we finally like broke the broke the joke. Vibu can't joke about this anymore.
Yeah, for some context, Vib, founder of Drip, who we had on the show before, took a selfie with Abhay and then said, "Great to be here with like the Helios Foundation CEO," and like tagged me, but it was a picture of Abhay, and then did the same thing with taking a picture with me and then tagging Abhay. So that was
he's a troll.
Pretty funny.
I didn't know he was a troll, but now all my interactions with him, he's constantly throwing jabs. Yeah, he's good at it.
Oh yeah. Okay. So my question. Okay. Talking about previous guests, we actually had Jeff Morris on, who's one of the minds behind Tinder's early success. Now managing partner Chapter One, and he said the Helium had a go-to-market campaign that was the best he's seen in crypto, which I think it was like the Miami Billboard. And it was like $5 internet or something along those lines. And so I want to talk about go-to-market and how you guys are actually, you said actually most of your users maybe aren't even familiar with crypto, right? What has that been like as like a crypto-heavy protocol, or at least some crypto-centric protocol? How has that shift been to getting users in the go-to-market for people who are not crypto native? Has that been like very difficult as a crypto protocol, or how should other founders think about it?
Yeah, I'll sort of maybe give two different answers there. One, so Helium Mobile is a new kind of carrier that's being built on top of the Helium network. It's being built by the original sort of founding team of the network, Nova Labs. They licensed the Helium name from us, the foundation, to sort of launch this carrier here in the US. Their whole thing is like, we have a better way to sort of a better kind of carrier and a sort of a better way to deploy these kinds of carriers. And I think the bet that they're taking, which I think is a really interesting one, is that the coverage of the Helium 5G network will grow so much and so sort of well in the cities that they're focused in, that most of the backhaul will happen on the Helium network versus the roaming partner that they have. They're working with T-Mobile, and that is a pretty scalable business. It's a very different way to build, and typically you have these things called MVNOs, mobile virtual network operators. Contrast them to MNOs, like Verizon, mobile network operators, Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, who actually own the network itself. So they're a very different kind of carrier, which I think is like, and that sort of, and they're also layering on some important features for this audience that that we know, like privacy features, sort of better customer experience, all those kinds of things are things that they're building. So they're building a mass market product. They're not building a crypto product. The crypto part is like an interesting thing, and it actually enables their business long term. Like that's what enables their business, but they want to be able to serve regular humans. They want to serve my mom. And in fact, like I onboarded my mom a few months ago onto Helium Mobile. She doesn't live in the country, so whenever she comes to visit, she pays Verizon some ludicrous amount for a prepaid plan, right? And changes their number every time. I said, no, this is ridiculous. Here's a $5 a month plan. Just keep it. Like,
yeah. And
that
your mom
yeah.
didn't need a wallet, right? She didn't need
Nope.
USDC or anything really
Nope.
to do with crypto, right? Yeah.
She didn't even install the app on her phone. We did it almost entirely on her laptop. And then we install the app on her phone. The app is the thing that sort of hides the wallet, and that's something that they've done, I think, really well. Which is that the app is a wallet, and I think they use like a wallet infrastructure provider to actually serve it. I forget which one it is, but they hide the sort of crypto bits unless you want to experience those crypto bits, right? So, what are those kinds of bits? Like there's this concept called mapping, discovery mapping on the network, and you can turn that on. You lose some amount of privacy, right? You're sort of making a proactive choice here. Like, contrast this from, like, I don't know, a typical ISP that is 100% selling like all of your like usage data, right? Like, here are all the websites that people in this zip code are going to. Like, that is incredibly valuable data, market research data. But you're sort of opted into that stuff by default. We've anonymized it. It's, you only know it by your zip code. Well, your zip code tells you a lot about you, right? Like, it tells you roughly your like socioeconomic state. It tells you, certainly tells you where you live. There's a lot of information that, you can tie back to you. And hey, you can, if you're a brand that wants to buy that kind of data, you can now send like crap tons of mailers to your house. I don't know if you get this in Canada, Mert, but like I just get so much garbage mail from like every Instagram like ad company that there is, like, all sorts of crap that we get. And like all of that's mined demographic data, and we know that, right? And part of your what you look at on the internet is going into that as an input. So, Helium Mobile is trying to do something entirely different, and I think that's pretty powerful. Yeah, like I think like ultimately, we saw this like really interesting launch that was very simple. Here's a $5 plan. You have to be in Miami. And why is it so specific? It's because they want to be able to build very, very dense coverage in an area to prove out this business model so that they can then move to the next one and the next one and the next one. And I think that's a different way to launch a carrier, and I'm excited to see them grow. I think these are the kinds of carriers I want to see built on Helium. They don't have to be the only one in the US. They also don't have to be the only one in the world. Helium Mobile was launched with this radio protocol called CBRS. It's a citizens band radio, and it's it's possible for us as regular human beings and not telcos to be able to put up our own radios that serve the cellular spectrum. But there are other ways that we can do this. Wi-Fi is the other option here. There will be a Wi-Fi hotspot that'll be launched later this year. There's certainly Nova's building one. I know of another one called Wi-Fi Dubba based in India. They're building one as well. Both not yet approved for the network, but they're working towards that. I think Wi-Fi, we're in this like really awesome time, I think, with eSIMs being very, very easy to install on our phones, and Wi-Fi offload actually working, at scale, where you could build a carrier anywhere in the world. In fact, like any individual or any brand could actually build their own carrier. And this was a hot thing in, I think I mentioned I was in payments for a while. There's a hot thing in payments. Like a company like Blackhawk would create gift cards for any brand out there. It's why when you go to like, in California, you go to Safeway and you see the big wall of like every single kind of gift card out there. It's like powered by Blackhawk. Tremendous business. I could imagine that in 5 years, we'll see that any brand out there will have their own carrier. Mr. Beast might have a carrier, which is crazy. Like I think that would be, and that's something that I think a network like Helium can enable. And I'm here for it.
To add some detail to that plan that happened in Miami, the $5 unlimited plan, if you sign up to that, it's really an agreement between T-Mobile, not T-Mobile, and then you have Helium Mobile. So that if you leave Miami, it's not that you lose coverage. You then basically go onto T-Mobile's network. But as part of that, Helium Mobile is not an ISP provider. That's actually T-Mobile. And they essentially have we're buying this wholesale from T-Mobile and then we're providing it to our users. When I first heard that on one of the podcasts that you were on, it made me think, why do these ISP providers allow, for example, Helium Mobile to almost use their network for their own product? Is that something that they know is going on? And why do they allow that?
Yeah, I think ultimately they are a lot of these cellular radios are being installed by professionals, right? And they're running it on sort of professional grade internet, and you as an individual have to figure out whether or not your professional internet or your home internet is sort of able to support this kind of sharing. But I think that's the sort of beauty of these kinds of networks, is that sort of you can decide whether or not you want to share your network for this purpose, right? In my mind, it's the same as sharing your Wi-Fi password with somebody else, right? And ultimately, that's a choice that you can make. And if some folks might choose to sort of upgrade their coverage because of that, or upgrade their backhaul because of it. We actually noticed this a little bit earlier on in the Helium network with the IoT side. We've had conversations with ISPs, and they sort of said they were looking for ways to partner with us. On the IoT side, it's not a ton of data. So there wasn't a lot of, I guess maybe there wasn't a lot of upside for them to really engage at that level. But with something like 5G, there is an opportunity of a lot more data. So I think that's an opportunity, right? And I think there's if I am, one thing that I think about with my home network, for example, I'm part of a wireless ISP here in the Bay Area, and I've got a microwave antenna to my roof, and half of that bandwidth goes to my house, and the other half gets shared with all my neighbors, and we're all sort of basically paying this ISP an administrative fee for an IP, right? Roughly. And we're paying sort of a maintenance fee that if our radios go offline, they'll come and climb on top of our roofs to fix it. But that kind of sharing, I mean, that's the kind of sharing that really attracted me to Helium in the first place. I've had that radio on my roof for the last 10 years almost. And how do you scale that globally? Really Helium is the way to scale that globally, I think. And that's what I expect to see in the market. That's what I expect to see with these ISPs. You're more likely to upgrade your service if you're also getting paid to sort of provide service to others as well, and you sort of want more bandwidth for yourself as well, right? And that's what I expect to happen over time. The Miami thing is kind of interesting. You actually described it as Helium Mobile is paying T-Mobile almost as an ISP, at a wholesale rate. The other thing that they're doing is they're paying the Helium network as the other ISP, right? Where that coverage is available, they're paying a wholesale rate as well to all these hotspot owners, effectively to provide coverage wherever they are. And as more of them are there, that's sort of better for their business, and then they want to be able to pay those cheaper wholesale rates to those hotspot owners.
Do you see this? So you mentioned Canada earlier, and I'm from Canada, unfortunately, and I would say Canada's run by
for now, right?
For now, yeah. I would say maybe it's run by a duopoly of two wireless or just ISPs, Rogers and Bell. And as a result, Canadian prices for internet are actually super high, especially comparatively to the United States, which many people don't know. And I have this this little pipe dream that it's if something like Helium existed much more prevalently in Canada, that could maybe shift the dynamics a bit more towards individual carriers and maybe more competition in the field. Is that so? Maybe this is a lower question, but for the future of Helium, the network, is that what is the vision there? Because you mentioned maybe one day Mr. Beast and stuff will be its own carrier, and maybe these different brands will have different carriers, or they'll be their own carriers. Do you see a world where Helium Network actually enables more wireless kind of or internet power to individual users, as opposed to these massive, colossal monopolies within Canada. And like, it doesn't have to be specific to Canada. We can, for political correctness, we can just say generic monopolies.
Well, I mean, you have a personal interest. I don't think there's anything wrong with sort of saying like, hey, like I'm in a country that has this duopoly, and that makes it harder, right? And I think, you say that like Canada has a duopoly, but the reality, even in the United States, is that there aren't a lot of providers, especially when you leave cities. And that's, I saw this incredible report the other day of, the cost of providing internet coverage to a just a Native American reservation in Nebraska. It's something along the lines of, it cost about $50,000 per household to bring fiber to their home. That is atrocious. Like, this is in the age, and this is Nebraska. This isn't like Alaska, right? And this is not like Panama, where this is in the age where we have Starlink and we have pretty cheap Wi-Fi routers. Like, let's build the network there, right? Like, that was my initial thought when I heard that. Like, how do I deploy a bunch of Starlink radios, a bunch of Helium Wi-Fi hotspots, and give a bunch of people some eSIMs, and like let them have their own self-sovereign network? Like, that's what I want to see in the world, and sure, I want to see that in Canada too, right? I think it's atrocious that we're spending, and I'm, obviously biased here. I think it's atrocious that we're spending so much money in infrastructure to trench through desert and put fiber through desert and forests and mountains and stuff like that. For a good cause. Like, let me be clear. Like, I believe every single human on this earth should have broadband internet. Like, no question. But the way that we're getting there seems incredibly inefficient, and I think there's sort of better ways to get there. The problems in using a network like Helium to enable this. I think there's two sides of this. There's one, which is the sort of backhaul, and there are multiple ways that you can get backhaul to an area. So think of like one of the largest sort of highest bandwidth lines that you can get to certain areas. So, can you get it over satellite? Yeah, we can get pretty decent these days. Can you do it with fixed wireless? I think yes. Like, so think of it like the microwave antenna on my roof. There's some really interesting companies. There's one in the Helium ecosystem called Wi-Fi Dubba. They're using point-to-point lasers to do high bandwidth links between different parts of cities. You don't need to trench. Fiber is of course another option. Cable's another option. Copper, just in general, is an option. But like, I think we have to allow for all these different options to provide backhaul. And I think there's probably a future where there's a Helium or Helium-like network that it sort of incentivizes massive backhaul projects. So that's one. From there, you need to have sort of local distribution, right? Like, how do you get, how do you become my house, right? How do you become the single node that is a hub that has 30 other nodes connected to it and provide connectivity to each one of these houses? I think Helium plays a role there, and then individual devices, right? How does an individual device authenticate? Those aren't now machine to machine interactions; you're sort of human to machine interactions, and that's definitely something that's a role that we're already playing, right? And that's what Helium Mobile is all about, and that's what Helium IoT is all about. So I think that's the place where Helium and Helium-like networks can really thrive. It's why I love DePIN, right? Like, I think this is why this is the most interesting thing for me as well to work on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny that I remember, maybe it was like 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, there'd be like guys who would buy like 50 hotspots and like go to like a local like village or something, or just a smaller town, and then just like distribute to like the tenants and then get like a fee of that and do like a revenue share. So at least all sorts of like interesting economic models. One thing kind of that you said I found kind of interesting, which is that I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, something like Nova Labs leased the Helium name from Foundation, something like that. How does
licensed it?
So I mean, okay. So while we're on that topic, I'm curious. So like, where people who don't know, there's Solana the network, there's Solana Foundation, there's Solana Labs, and then it seems like Helium maybe has some sort of a similar. Maybe there's Nova Labs, which does products, and then there's like Helium Foundation, which does foundation stuff. how should we think about it? Like, how is the structure there, and what is maybe the role of each?
Yeah, the way that I like to think about it is that the foundation folk works on the protocol, and like companies like Nova Labs build apps, right? And the two apps that Nova Labs works on today, number one is Helium Mobile. This is this carrier that's based in the U.S. that launched in Miami, and we'll start to grow from there. And then there's another sort of product group inside there called 1663, and that is their IoT services company, and they're building on the IoT side of the Helium network. So they're think of them like an apps company that's sort of building on top of this network. Obviously, they have a lot of history and knowledge about the old chain and about proof of coverage, and they work on things in the ecosystem. They're community developers for some of the things that we work on too. But the foundation is responsible for the core protocol, all the Solana programs, and then so from a technical perspective, we're responsible there. We're also responsible for the LoRaWAN protocol. So, how does Helium implement LoRaWAN? And how, what is the firmware that sits on all these on all these pieces of hardware that's deployed? Are they using the right frequency plans in the right countries? Like, we're an active conversation right now is there are a bunch of countries in Africa that are not specified of what frequency plan they should use. We think it's our role here to be an advocate for those countries and say we should use these frequencies here. We're working with local authorities to try to suss out what is correct there before this sort of regulatory sort of body, sort of corporate body, sort of corporate regulatory body called the LoRa Alliance sort of decides here's the frequency plan for this area, right? So that's our role. Like, we live in the protocol. And we allow for folks to, we say, hey, come build on top of us. And how do we enable you to build more stuff on top of us? So if another service provider, another carrier comes along, they'd come to us and be like, hey, we'd like to build alongside Nova and be like the carrier for Canada, or maybe the carrier for the UK, or we want to be a competitive carrier in the US. Welcome the competition.
I'm curious, would you say it's harder to build out these DePIN networks than it is, in other DEX? But once you actually have built that out and gotten adoption, I would think you have much stronger moats because you do have this physical infrastructure, similar to what Amazon would have with AWS or their logistics network, or even Walmart with their stores. And as part of that too, I'm curious, as this grows and you did have competitors pop up in the space, if you're one of these operators that's providing a hotspot, is it going to be as easy as maybe an Uber driver that can switch between Uber and Lyft? Is it that easy for someone to be like, oh, this network's actually paying me more right now, I'll switch? Or how do you think about competition, moats, and just a sustainable network?
I don't think we're there yet. I think the reality is that it's still as fast as we've grown as a network in such a short amount of time, in 4 years. I don't think we're at a steady state yet where I could say that it's just easy to move around or easy to sort of, do we have a moat? I would argue that inertia is still the strongest factor here, right? Is it possible for you to pull out some hardware, take the SD card out, flash it with something else, put it back in? For me, yeah, of course, it'd be easy, but that is not the market. That's not the user base that we're talking about here. And it's unfair to expect any, regular Helium hotspot deployer to be able to do that. And I think that's why there should be companies built around enabling, maintenance of these hotspots. I think and then there are a few out there that are sort of building tools around this stuff. We still need to push towards a more consistent firmware. One of I think a really good decision we made along the way was sort of we kind of open source the firmware on what runs on hotspots, and we brought in and we created a community-driven sort of ecosystem and sort of community-mandated ecosystem where hotspot manufacturers could get approved and they could run this firmware and they could be part of the Helium network. All that was built, but it also created a long tail of hotspot manufacturers. Some of whom haven't been able to continue maintaining the network and maintaining their part of the network. And so I think it is actually important for us as a foundation now to build common firmware where another manufacturer could take on a fleet, for example, and for a fee or because they it's not too expensive for them to continue to do that work. I think that's what I want to see over the next couple of years, especially especially during a bear market. I think people people will happily just leave something running if it's just doing what they think it's doing. But they'll also like ultimately they do care, right? About like, hey, is this thing, doing what I thought it was supposed to do? So, I think making things simpler, easier is still it's still part of our roadmap.
Abhay, one thing I'm curious about is, so Helium is now on Solana, and so is Hivemapper and Render's migrating, and there's also like I think it's called Otoi, which is like high precision positioning systems, and Teleport, decentralized Uber.
Onakoi.
Onakoi, yeah. Sorry.
Otoi is render. Otoi is render. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So it seems like there is maybe an influx or like a cluster of DePIN applications that are building on, or protocols building on Solana. Do you think at all this gives Solana any like benefits in terms of like attracting other DePIN builders, or do you think like these types of app protocol builders will just start from first principles every single time and just go to whatever chain, like maybe their app chain? How do you think about like the network effects there?
Well, I think one of the things that we did a lot of, hopefully, and folks are, hopefully folks are benefiting from that, is like we sort of built a lot of like fundamental tools that you need for these kinds of DePIN projects. We open sourced the Helium program library from the start. We're working with some of these teams, some that you mentioned, to actually use that for their work. And I think that that hopefully is an accelerator for them to get them to be able to adopt Solana and launch on Solana sooner. And I think that's something that we're always open to doing. I think, both Noah and I have a very strong sort of belief in open source tooling and sort of making, this kind of stuff better, as much as like there is, I will say though that there is almost no documentation. The documentation is probably like my head, Noah's head, Bry's head, like, sadly, that's where we are. But yeah, engineer problems. But like, I think that this is something that we is there? I think your bigger question is around like, is there a network effect? Is there sort of a is there some kind of point where if you're building one of these DePIN projects, you go, well, I'll just launch on Solana because that's obviously the place to be for this stuff. I don't know if we're there yet. I think it really only happens when there is a clear composability story between these projects, right? I'll give a perfect example of a project that uses Helium that isn't on Solana, Demo, right? And Demo uses Helium for backhaul. They're about to launch a new kind of ODB2 device that you can plug into your car that only uses Helium for backhaul, and it's very easy for them to go buy HNT on a DEX or on a centralized exchange, burn it for data credits, and all the Demo devices can have backhaul. Like that's not hard for them today, and so like I don't know if they have any interest in being on Solana. More than happy to help them if that's something that they want to do at some point. But there's no like driving force right now, right? Like there's nothing forcing them to get there. But if you're a brand new project and you haven't built any protocol stuff and you want a place to start, I would open up the Helium program library and just start there. Like that is definitely gonna sort of accelerate shipping something on chain. The other thing that I think is interesting, we were hoping for some of the tools that were already there on Solana to sort of accelerate our ability to govern our network, because governing, I think you mentioned this, like governing these kinds of networks is very different than something like a DeFi protocol. And so you have a lot more. And for me, the reason why I think it's harder is because you have a lot more stakeholders and a lot more sort of variety of stakeholders. You're not homogenous. For Helium, you have people that are providing coverage, people that are using that coverage, maybe people that are staking and all those other parties as well. But all of those need to sort of have their own ways to vote. And in Helium, like you even have geographical subslices. Like we've had a governance action that only affected Australia. Like how do you carve out that like wallet holder base? And that's something that I think it's not easy to do with existing tools. So that's why we started building modular governance, and we're going to publish that, and that's going to be something that we hope other projects will probably need. Especially DePIN projects will probably need something like that.
It's interesting. I think a lot of people from the Ethereum ecosystem probably don't even know what DePIN is, or maybe they've heard the term, but they're not very involved. And I think part of that's just the EVM and the high fees. Like, it's not scalable. You need extremely low fees because these payments and all the NFTs that you have, then there's millions of NFTs, and then also the payments are very small, right? So if you have high transaction fees, you're going to get negative very quickly if you have any sort of these spikes. You've seen Neil from Eclipse. They just announced their like general L2 launching on Ethereum, SVM L2. And he actually talked about one of the main use cases he hopes to bring to Ethereum is DePIN. So I am curious to see how that split between the network effect you have in Solana right now and any new DePIN protocols that pop up, if they naturally come to Solana or if they start looking into something like the SVM L2, which the big difference is Solana is actually running and proven today. So I think that's the tailwind there. One thing I did want to ask about is, some of these other DePIN protocols, you have Render, and they have a tailwind with the AI, revolution, as some people would say, with the demand for GPUs. What would be a tailwind for Helium, besides just the fact that, like, if you have a bull market, we won't get to token prices, but obviously people would like to put up new hotspots because they're going to be rewarded in HNT, and if prices are going up, that's a great thing. But is there any other tailwind otherwise? Just like, is there demand for these hotspots similar to there's a demand for more GPUs?
So on the mobile side, I think that the tailwind is pretty clear. It's the demand for bandwidth, like, it continues to increase, right? Like, I don't know, like, even in my house, I think there's probably like 7 or 8 devices that are cellular connected. When my kids watch whatever Bluey or something like that, like, they're sort of streaming pretty high quality video to their devices at all times. And then this is like, this is the demand is only increasing. It's like also very, very mobile. I definitely like love watching highlights of some game from the night before when I'm sitting and waiting for I'll throw my kids under the bus again, waiting to pick them up at school. So like that, this sort of the demand will continue to increase on the mobile side, and this is something that we've continued to see. The other side of this is that the cost of deploying this kind of hardware is incredibly high. Verizon spent a crap ton of money trying to deploy 5G all over the US, and then they had to rip it all out and put out another full release of brand new hardware because the standard changed. So these costs are incredibly high. This sort of like $50,000 for a single home to get fiber because it's in the middle of nowhere and or seemingly in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. Like, those kinds of costs exist, and those are real. And I think finding more efficient ways to provide high bandwidth infrastructure to every single person in the world, I think that's where the demand will come on the mobile side. On the IoT side, I think each one of these devices are the number of these devices is going up exponentially, and having a large, available, reliable network that's very, very cost effective will drive demand on the IoT side. And so I think that's where the tailwind comes. The tailwind comes from for me, it comes from utility, not from token price. And so I think that's what we spend our time on, and that's what we're trying to promote.
So, Abhay, we've talked obviously a lot about DePIN in this episode. I am curious to get your thoughts on just the general state of crypto, right? So you have DeFi, you have payments, you have gaming, you have, I don't know, a lot of other stuff, MEV, just a whole lot of different sectors within crypto. There's obviously regulation. Maybe Asia's regulation is more friendly. Maybe there's migrations. There's so many things happening. What do you think about the current state of crypto? Like, what's your take? What is your mental model of how you think about these things?
I think ultimately crypto is a tool, right? Like, and we are like, I spend all of my time on Helium, right? Like, I'm not really like as attuned to some of the things that are happening in other parts of crypto. I think in general, why do we use these kinds of tools? Like, as an engineer, I want I want the system that allows for the sort of maximum product value, right, for my end customer. And I believe ultimately that these tools that we're starting to build and we're not complete on yet. We're certainly not complete. I think these are the tools that will help enable sort of a new kind of commerce, a new kind of marketplace, and will continue to sort of build over time. And the sort of macro it'll take years to change. So that's like, bear markets are like, I think we've all heard this before. Bear markets are great for builders. And I'm certainly building because of that. I think things that I get excited about in crypto that have nothing to do with DePIN really probably are around, things around identity. And because like ultimately identity is, and there has to be like multiple ways of sort of identifying yourself, right? And sort of decentralized identity is a really tough problem, I think. And I think that is a place that I, love to see more of. I think that it's important to have these kinds of systems, because ultimately, like, we don't have really great systems in crypto to like, for around Sybil resistance. And I think that's like a thing that a lot of our projects sort of have to deal with. And I'd love to not have to solve that problem. So like, if all the other efforts happening there, great, go for it. Like that would be great. I think some of the things that are happening in DeFi are, sort of very macro, sort of very affected by the macro, right? Like we're in a risk-off environment, and and I think ultimately, like that's sort of driving the rest of the crypto landscape. It has effects on all of us, right? There's no question. But those things are cyclic, and we sort of resolve that over time, I think. So, I don't know, to other founders, I would say, figure out where to cut costs, figure out where to survive, and figure out where you can like continue to build. That is the place that we all need to be, because they sort of and sort of ignore the macro cycles.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe, Mert, before we go into rapid fire, I'd love to hear, is there any type of composability right now between Helium and other, whether it's DeFi or some other protocol in Solana? Like, is there a benefit there, or is the true benefit right now just the low cost, the speed, and all the infrastructure?
I think the low cost is definitely a thing. That's a huge benefit. I mean, having a single token program, I think that's composability on its own, right? Like that, I know I've definitely talked to folks that want to deploy, that want to sort of implement HNT and Helium and the other tokens in their sort of protocols and their platforms. Having to integrate a brand new L1 is a lot of work. Like there's no question. And being in an ecosystem where you have a single token standard like actually makes a huge difference. And being in the same ecosystem as other tokens also makes a huge difference. So I think that is that's definitely huge. Outside of that, like the other thing that I sort of like about the Solana ecosystem is that the sort of builders in the ecosystem just build shit and tell you about it after. It's like, oh, this is on Solana. I can now do this, and hey, look what I just built, right? And that's basically happened from the day that we launched on Solana, including to like 15 minutes before we started recording, right? Like, hey, I built this thing, check it out. Like, and that's that's kind of, I sort of made a tongue-in-cheek joke on Twitter the other day of like composabilities, maybe the friends we made along the way. And like, but I think that's true, right? Like ultimately, like the builders are your friends, right? And they're the ones that sort of show up and say, hey, like we built this thing because you guys are in this ecosystem, and it's possible to. Like it is, we are actually able to do it here.
All right. So I'm actually not going to do rapid fire today, but I do want to ask the classic question that I always ask, mainly for my own benefit as a selfish person, which is that, Abhay, you are the CEO of Helium Foundation, and that definitely cannot be an easy task, and it certainly requires a lot of responsibility and operational chops. So I guess I'm curious, you did actually just give somewhat of like a little piece of advice for like cutting costs or figuring out where to cut costs just before this answer. But I'm curious if you could just give one piece of advice to founders or operators in crypto right now. What would you hope they take away? What would it be?
I mean, I think number one, are you building something that people want, right? Like if you aren't, then what are you even doing? Why are you even bothering? Like, are you solving a problem that actually needs to be solved? Like, there's a customer on the other side of that problem, right? Like that wants you to solve it. And I think that's really, really important. Number two, like solve for the math problem, right? Like the math problem is like, here's money coming in and here's money going out. And, especially in a market, like this, like I've now, had both the pleasure and the pain of being at many, many startups. And some of them have been very successful and have been I've been very lucky to be a part of those teams. And some have been like total failures, right? And we've had to shut down, we've had to sell, we've had to just close shop. Like all those things happen in startups, and this is the sort of environment that I appreciate and I love being in. But like ultimately it comes down to a math problem that is like, money in, money out. And what is your next milestone and what do you plan to do with that next milestone? Right. And that's, to every founder, like just keep your eyes on that prize and like everything else is noise. Right. And, while you're doing that, solve for the people, right? That are sort of on that mission with you. Cause yeah, like you're the CEO. It's a very, very lonely position. Like, and that's okay. Ask other CEOs, ask other founders for help. They're often the ones that you can bounce stuff off of. And friend them or whatever you need to do to make it okay. And ask for help where you need it, but then like solve for the people behind you because you might be at the tip of the spear, but there's no way you're going to do it without the people on your team. Right. So like make sure that they're good and they're well informed and they know what's going on, the whole time. So that's, I guess that's like the thing that sometimes you forget in a very sort of bullish environment. And it's easy to lose track of that kind of stuff. So yeah, don't like if or when like any of this sort of changes, don't forget those things as well, because like, what are you solving for? Are you solving for a real product or a real problem? Are you reaching your next milestone? What is that next milestone? And like, are you able to solve the math problem until you get there?
Yeah, that's a really great answer. Well, Abhay, thanks so much for coming on today. This is really exciting. I'm pumped for DePIN. And look, if you're not actually involved directly in DePIN yourself, it's worth learning about, not only because it's interesting, but it's actually something that you can use to explain to someone like what can crypto actually do and provide to this world. So it's a super interesting topic. I actually explained this to somebody yesterday as I was prepping for this who had no idea about crypto. And it took 30 seconds for them to be like, oh, okay, I could see how that could work. So very exciting. Thanks again for coming on. We'll have to do this again soon.
For sure, Garrett. Thanks, Mark.
Sweet. We'll see you next time.